Hello, everyone. My name is LJ Stambuk, and I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council. What an hour we have ahead of us, an hour and a half, with Tom Standage from The Economist of London, the best magazine, business and political magazine in the world. And as some of you know, we've had a very long and fruitful relationship with The Economist over the years, had a number of the editors and columnists from The Economist in Charlotte. Today, we have Tom Standage, columnist and deputy editor at The Economist, not in Charlotte with us, but in London. And we'll talk a little bit about London. And he's going to be speaking about the world in 2021. As the community's premier global education, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, the World Affairs Council Charlotte has always sought to bring the world closer to you and to build a community of internationally informed and engaged citizens. Dialogue, knowledge, active participation, and an understanding of global issues are vitally important for our democracy to flourish at all levels. A little bit of housekeeping here. Please note that your microphone will be on mute and your camera will be turned off for the duration of this presentation. To submit a question at any time, and we do want you to submit questions, please use the question and answer box in the Zoom toolbar, not the chat. The question and answer box in your Zoom toolbar, and you can see it circled in red on the toolbar. As you probably know, this presentation will be recorded and will be shared with you via the World Affairs Council mailing list. So please make sure you're signed up to receive our emails so you can get the video recording of the event today. If you're registered to participate in the World Affairs Council networking reception after today's program, please stay on the Zoom call once the presentation has ended. Our staff will enable your microphone and camera access, which we ask that you please turn on to participate. And if you want to join us, there's still time and availability. I'll let our staff know and we can have you join the World Affairs Council networking reception discussing the world in 2021 after the presentation and discussion. Upcoming programs, excited to share with you that we'll have Elaine Scolino, former Paris bureau chief for the New York Times, a New York Times best-selling author on the Seine, the river that made Paris. This is next Tuesday, February 16. And next Thursday, I'm delighted to share with you that Mohit Joshi, president of Infosys, will be with us. He'll speak on the role of tech in the post-pandemic recovery of the financial system. This is all next week, Tuesday and Thursday. Please do join us. And again, we're truly thankful for your support. And we ask that you consider making a contribution, if you can, in order to help sustain our vital place in Charlotte's civic landscape at this difficult, challenging times for us. And let me use this opportunity to thank our board members who are here with us today, participating, for their leadership and their guidance, because we would not be here today and be able to do what we're doing without their participation, support, and leadership. So thank you, World Affairs Council Charlotte board members. As you know, we're on social media. I know that all of you are on social media. Choose your social media channel, and we are there. Please like us, share, and follow the World Affairs Council Charlotte. We'll be delighted to have you join us. We're coming to the best part, the introduction. Tom Standage is the deputy editor of The Economist and editor of the yearly The World In series. Tom is also responsible for the newspaper's digital strategy and the development of new digital products, including Espresso and Economist films. He joined The Economist as science correspondent in 1998 and was subsequently appointed technology editor, business editor, and digital editor. Tom is the author of 6 history books, including Writing on the Wall, The Victorian Internet, and A History of the World in 6 Glasses. Tom studied engineering and computing at Oxford University and has written for other publications, including the New York Times, the Daily Telegraph, The Guardian, and Wired, taking a particular interest in the Internet's culture and historical significance. So I'm delighted to greet you all here, but most of all, Tom Standage, thank you for being here with us today from London. The podium, as they say, is all yours, Tom.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me, and greetings from snowy London, where it's just about freezing here, and it's going to be freezing for the next few days. So we're really feeling the icy blast at the moment. And I understand you've got a storm going on at your end as well. So let's hope that we don't have any power cuts, and we're all able to stay together in this virtual space. Yes, I wear many hats at The Economist, and one of the hats that I wear is editing our annual, The World In. And the most recent edition, The World in 2021, came out in the middle of November. And this is the cover here. And you can see it's a slot machine, which gives you a sense of the extraordinary uncertainty that we face in the world at the moment. So what I'm going to be taking you through now is my top 10 trends, which are drawn from the pages of The World in 2021, my top 10 things to watch out for this year, and the sort of forces that I think will shape the way that the year will unfold. So let's jump right into it. I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes, and then there'll be a chance for Q&A. So do put those questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. Thank you. Right. Well, obviously, the biggest thing going on is the pandemic. And we're now into this phase now of basically what we're calling the fight for a vaccine. It's fights happening within countries, also fights happening between countries about who should get vaccines, which are the best vaccines, what's the best approach to administering vaccines, the priority order of administering the vaccines, and so forth. And we're at a rather difficult stage now, I think. At the end of last year, there was a lot of optimism that the vaccines would be a sort of silver bullet. And there were politicians saying that, we'll be back to normal by the spring or back to normal by the summer. And so on. And it seemed like a sort of miracle. And it is a miracle in a sense, because vaccines have never been developed so quickly against a specific disease. And not only do we have vaccines that work, we have several of them. So that really is a great achievement. But we've also seen the emergence of these new variants, some of which are capable of getting round the vaccines to some extent. And so the vaccines are less effective against some of these variants. So we now have this race between injection and infection, and different countries are doing better than others, shall we say. Surprisingly, in Britain, we seem to be doing quite well. We've got up to about 18% of the population vaccinated now, I believe, which is one of the only areas that we're leading the world in a good way. Most of the league tables to do with COVID, Britain is doing very badly. But I think this really points to the fact that vaccination is a lot more complicated than people thought it was going to be at the end of last year. Just the basic logistics of manufacturing billions of doses, getting them into cold storage. Have you got enough glass? Have you got enough needles? Some of these vaccines need to be kept at very low temperatures, minus 70 degrees centigrade. And that the Pfizer vaccine, which needs to be kept that cold, can only be moved 4 times. And then once you open it, you've got 1,000 or so doses, and you have to essentially use them all very, very quickly in the space of a day or so. And so you've got to make sure you've got all of the people lined up that you can jab with the vaccine. So there's just basic logistical challenges to begin with. Then you've got the fact that there isn't enough vaccine for everybody yet, and there's not going to be widespread vaccination in most countries in the world until probably 2023 at the earliest. We've got lots of rich countries that have overordered, and they've ordered 4 or 5 times as much as they need to vaccinate the whole population. But it's now looking as though even the countries that managed to vaccinate a lot of people early on this year may have to go back and give them boosters towards the end of the year to cover them against new variants. And it then looks as though we're going to actually have endemic coronavirus. It's going to be everywhere, and we're going to have annual shots that protect us against it, rather like we do with the flu. That seems to be the long-term position, and that puts some countries in a very difficult position now. If your strategy has been based on suppression, which is the case in, say, Taiwan or New Zealand, and you've basically got no cases to speak of, that works very well now. But once you want to open your borders to the rest of the world, even if you've vaccinated your whole population and you only allow people in who are vaccinated, you are going to start to, it's not going to be a watertight seal, as it were. These vaccines aren't 100% effective. To work really well, you need to have herd immunity, and even herd immunity looks like quite a tall order, given that large numbers of people are reluctant to have the vaccines. So I'm afraid we're in for a year of of basically agonizing about vaccines and who gets them and whether they work or not. And the idea that this is all just going to go away in the spring, unfortunately, looks very, very over optimistic. So that is one of the great sources of uncertainty for this year, exactly how quickly populations can be vaccinated and exactly how quickly this will suppress the virus. And I wish I could be more optimistic about it, but unfortunately the uncertainty is going to continue. The second big source of uncertainty is related to this, and it's what happens with the economic recovery. And we've seen that, we saw this particularly in the US last year, when the initial lockdowns were lifted, the economy really did roar back incredibly quickly. And one of my colleagues at The Economist, Henry Kerr, the economics editor, he said that one of the things that economists were surprised by, and in fact, wished they had predicted differently, was just how quickly the US economy came back. So we know that when you put an economy into lockdown, you're not just suppressing demand for things, you're suppressing supply for things as well. This is a very unusual kind of economic shock. Normally you have a supply shock or a demand shock, and the lockdown is both of them at the same time. But we also know that when you lift it, that things can come back very quickly. So what we've seen around the world is that you get these lockdowns, varying degrees of constraints on the economy, and they go on and off. And in Britain we have this system with tiers, and different cities and different regions are in different tiers at different times, and so you get this very, very patchy geographical recovery. You also have an amazing amount of patchiness between industries. So some industries have been very heavily hit here, aviation, hospitality, and so forth, whereas others go from strength to strength. Technology industry seems to be having a great pandemic. The more we have to do everything online, the more we need their products. We need big screens, we need cloud computing capacity, we need new software, we want cameras and lights and all sorts of things to go in our home offices. And that's been a bonanza. And it's been a bonanza in particular for manufacturers in China, because China managed to suppress the virus quite early on. Its factories were basically ready for business by the time lockdowns began in the rest of the world, and they were able to supply a lot of the things that the rest of the world needed, like PPE and big screens and hot tubs and all of the other sorts of things that people seem to be ordering in the pandemic. And the extraordinary statistic that we have in the world in 2021 is one of the most amazing figures in there, is that if you look at China's economy in 2021, if you look at where it's going to be at the end of this year, the nominal GDP of China, and if you then go and look back in 2019 at where economists and forecasters thought that China's GDP would be, so this is where they're making predictions in late 2019 for the size of the Chinese economy 2 years later. So they're guessing how big it's going to be in 2021. And it turns out that those figures are underestimates. Even though the pandemic had not begun, China is actually going to end up being bigger. It's going to be as if the pandemic had never happened. It was the only major economy to grow last year, and it really has bounced back incredibly quickly. The rest of the world, a very much more patchy situation. Some countries have done better than others, but essentially we've got big recessions in much of the developed world. And we also have a debate going on about inflation, and whether inflation is going to be a problem. Our view at The Economist is that inflation is unlikely to be a problem in the Eurozone in Japan, but we're very worried that policymakers will tighten too much because they're worried about it, and that would cause problems. In the US, we are a bit more concerned about inflation, particularly if the stimulus ends up being as big as Joe Biden would like it to be. We're worried that could lead to inflationary pressure. And that could lead to all sorts of problems, because if you then have to rein that in, then the presumption that everyone has been making that money is going to be cheap forever suddenly looks much shakier. So again, an enormous amount of uncertainty on the economy, and that depends, and the way it unravels, the way it unfolds, depends to a great degree on what's happening with the vaccine. And then we have a third source of uncertainty, which is why I went for a slot machine on the cover of The World in 2021, and that is the shifts in geopolitics. So obviously we've got a new president in the United States. We're about to get, at the end of this year, we'll get a new chancellor in Germany. We fairly recently had a new prime minister in Japan, who looks a bit wobbly now. And obviously Xi Jinping isn't going anywhere, but that means that 3 of the world's 4 biggest economies will have changed their leadership within the space of a little over a year. So what does that mean? Well, the biggest changes are obviously going to be the extent to which Joe Biden can undo some of the things that Donald Trump has done. Donald Trump obviously was not a fan of global rules-based international order and set about destroying it as quickly as he could. So he pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, he crippled the WTO, he pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. Obviously, he started a trade war, not just with China, but also with traditional American allies like Mexico, Canada, and the EU. So how quickly can Joe Biden put Humpty Dumpty back together again on these things? That's the big question. We're going from America first to America is back, but America is back is easier said than done. There are some things that Joe Biden can do quite quickly. Obviously, re-entering the Paris Climate Agreement happened right away, and then the World Health Organization going back into that as well. But others are going to be a lot more difficult. Rebooting the Iran nuclear deal, for example, is going to be tricky, and we've seen the beginning of the maneuvering around that. So there is a great deal of sort of uncertainty about what is going to change and how quickly Joe Biden is going to be able to reassure America's traditional allies that that America is going to undo some of the changes made by Donald Trump. And there's one area in particular where I think people may be surprised at how little changes between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and that is on China. The trade war that Donald Trump started with China is going to continue. I think that Joe Biden is just going to prosecute that trade war in a rather different way, and probably a rather more coherent and organized way. If you do want to take China down a peg or two, if you want to complain about its human rights record, if you're worried about intellectual property theft, and so forth, then and these are all things that reasonable people have come to decide in the West that are worth doing. You don't necessarily want to go about doing those. You don't necessarily want to pick a fight with China the way that Donald Trump did with tariffs and so forth. So what I think we're going to see, and in fact what we're starting to see already from Joe Biden, is much more of a united front being formed by essentially the Western democracies, where he's going to try and rally the EU and other democracies to present a united front against China and stand up to Chinese intellectual property theft, certainly, to push them on trade and equal terms for better terms for Western firms going into China and so forth. So I think we're going to see the tariffs staying in place because that gives Joe Biden very helpful bargaining chips, but I think we'll be surprised that the trade war is not going to come to an end. It's just going to be fought in a different way, and we are going to continue to see US-China tensions. In fact, we're probably going to see increasing US-China tensions given the strategic importance of things like Taiwan's chip-making industry. Taiwan is now in this extraordinary position that its chip-making giant TSMC has become a strategic partner to America's biggest tech companies. And at the same time, America has been cutting off China's access to chip technology. And so that puts Taiwan absolutely at the center of this geopolitical struggle. And this is in fact part of a broader trend, which is that companies have found themselves on the front line in the US-China struggle. Many different industries, quite surprising industries, have found themselves in this position. My favorite example is the French wine industry. So one of the things that Donald Trump did was impose oh no, hang on, that's Harley Davidson with the steel tariffs. French companies, France wanted to impose taxes on big American tech companies, and so the Trump administration retaliated by saying that it would impose import tariffs on French wine, making French wine more expensive for you in America. And this is not an industry that has been used to having to play geopolitics. There are industries like aviation and oil and so on that are used to the fact that what they do is inherently political. But other industries have really had to get used to this very quickly, and we've seen this with tech companies as well. Clearly Huawei has been at the center of the arguments between China and the rest of the world about whether China can be trusted and whether its telecoms equipment can be trusted. More recently, TikTok was at the center of all of this. And so these are companies that are being used as sort of proxy battlefields but for conflicts between countries. And in fact, TikTok literally was used as a proxy battlefield because China and India had a clash in Kashmir towards the end of last year. And rather than retaliating in a military sense, India decided to retaliate by banning a whole load of Chinese apps from Indian app stores. So it really is a substitution of one battlefield for another. However, companies are finding themselves not just on the front line when it comes to US and China, but also on a whole wide range of other issues, from climate change to social justice. And I think this reflects the fact that companies have got an awful lot of power, but it's also that a lot of people have lost trust in their elected politicians to get anything done. And I think this, was a big part of the appeal of Donald Trump, that he promised a different approach, and a lot of people were willing to give him a try. We're now in the extraordinary position, if you've seen the most recent Edelman Trust Barometer, that companies and CEOs are actually more trusted than politicians. Now, that probably just means that politicians aren't terribly trusted, but if you want to get things changed and you feel that politicians aren't doing a very good job, then maybe putting pressure on companies by boycotting some products or deciding to support other products is a way of doing it. And that's certainly a position that a lot of companies have taken. Companies are also finding themselves under pressure, not just from consumers, but from their own workforces. So we've seen a growing trend in employee activism with, companies, big tech companies, for example, coming under pressure from their own employees not to do business with certain bits of the US government or whatever. And companies and CEOs are expected to take positions on things, whether it's Black Lives Matter or climate change. And this is something that some CEOs are willing to do and other CEOs are much less willing to do. So we've seen this situation where CEOs are really expected to be politicians, and some of them, shall we say, are better at it than others. The big question for business, though, I think, as we start to, get on top of things with vaccination, and we start to see the beginnings of a new normal emerging, and I don't think we'll see that fully until 2022. But the big question is, once the pandemic starts to recede, which of the new behaviours that we have adopted around the world as a result of the pandemic, which of them will stick and which of them will not? And just to give you a sense of the variation here, because the answer is there isn't really a single answer, but if you look at this chart here, this is a chart from McKinsey, and down the left-hand side, I hope you can see it, you've basically got a whole bunch of different activities down the left. You've got online streaming at the top, you've got remote learning, you've got restaurant curbside pickup, you've got store curbside pickup, and across the top you've got lots of different countries. And essentially the bluer the blob, the more the people in that country have been doing the activity in question more than they used to. And if there's a star, that means that at least 50% of the increased usage is among people who've never done it before. And so you can see we've got quite a patchy situation here where people have been adopting lots of new activities, but more in some countries than others. For example, in Italy has been a laggard in e-commerce for many years, but Italy has really surged ahead with shopping online, and a lot of those shoppers who have shopped online for the first time are going to continue to do so. So where did we end up with all of this then? We're going to have working from home, schooling from home, shopping from home, all of these things we've got used to. How much of that is going to persist in the post-pandemic era? And the answer is there is no single answer. It's going to vary by industry. It's going to vary by country as well. Some industries are very happy to have people work from home, the tech industry, financial services, for example. Other industries, you can't work from home, or you may live in a country where culturally living and working from home is less acceptable. If you look at surveys of bosses in Western Europe and in the US are generally quite keen for people to work from home a few days a week if their job allows it. If you look at surveys of bosses in Japan and China, the enthusiasm is much lower. It's typically 4 or 5% compared to say 30% for financial services bosses in the US. So there is really a very wide variation. What this means is that companies are going to have to be very fast on their feet as the new normal starts to emerge, because they're going to have to be able to respond to the new needs of their customers, whether they go back to doing things the way they did before, whether they continue to do these new behaviors, or whatever the mix is in between. So they're going to need good analytics. They're going to need to be able to monitor what their customers are doing and how they're behaving very quickly, so that they can respond appropriately. Okay, my seventh of my top 10 trends. Clearly, a much less footloose world. We've seen far less travel in the past year, and the idea that we would be able to start travelling again this year is starting to recede into the distance. A lot of people in Britain thought that we might get to have a normal summer holiday somewhere warm in Europe this summer, and that's starting to look increasingly unlikely. If for no other reason that the European countries may not even let us in. We don't know how it's going to work out. But clearly we've seen fewer tourists, which is, tourism is a huge industry. Some countries depend enormously for their GDP on tourism. Also, fewer migrants, fewer foreign students, which breaks the business model of many universities, particularly in English-speaking countries, that rely on foreign students for a disproportionate fraction of their revenue. And also less business travel. And in fact, the fact there's less business travel has a knock-on effect on travel in general, because business travellers, as you will be aware, are a small fraction of the overall number of travellers, but they are a disproportionate fraction of the profits of both airlines and hotel chains. So if there are fewer business travellers, that means there's less of that profit to cross-subsidise basically cheaper fares for everybody else. And I think business travel is unlikely to return to the level that it was at before the pandemic. If you look at previous crises such as 9/11 and the global financial crisis, business travel did not return to its pre-crisis level. What happened instead was that tourism grew, and so overall travel returned to a higher level, but it was because of a greater amount of leisure travel rather than business travel. And I think, Bill Gates said recently he thinks about 50% of business travel may have gone away permanently. Other people have put this at 30%. I think that sounds quite plausible to me. I think, a big chunk of business travel is actually internal business travel. So it's visiting people in your own firm at other offices. And that's the sort of thing that I think a lot more companies are going to say, well, actually, we could do that with a video call. And besides, while we're struggling in this economic crisis, an easy thing to cut is the travel budget. So we are going to see some business travel, particularly if your competitors are sending salespeople back on the road, you're going to want to do the same as well. So it's not going to go away altogether, but I think it's going to not bounce back to the level it was at before. However, there is a silver lining in all of this, which is this is an opportunity to really change the situation on climate change. Now, that's not because there's less travel going on and less industrial activity, although there is. That has only actually reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 8% during 2020, which isn't enough. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 100%. So that means an 8% cumulative reduction for a couple of decades. So that shows you the scale of the problem. No, the reason that this is an opportunity, well, there's a couple of reasons. The first is that the stimulus packages that are being proposed both in Europe and in the US have a large green component to them. Joe Biden says that when he talks about climate change, when he thinks about climate change, it makes him think of good, well-paying union jobs. So he's trying to make climate change into the friend of the working man. This is going to mean the creation of lots of jobs, and America needs lots of new jobs to be created. So why not create them in green industries like fitting electric car charging points? You're going to need a whole load of those, building electric cars, wind turbines, retrofitting houses so that they use less energy, and so on and so on. Similarly, in Europe, the recovery package there, not as big as the American one. The American one will be what, 1.9 trillion. In Europe, it's a bit less than $1 trillion, but about a third of it is meant to be attached to green projects, and so that's going to mean the creation of lots of green jobs, people hope. But it should also change the dynamic, the fact that America has gone back into the Paris Climate Agreement, and also the fact that China at the end of last year said it was going to aim to be carbon neutral by 2050. Now that's a very big deal because China is the biggest carbon emitter in the world, and that puts pressure on other countries to also make similar pledges, notably India, which has not really said very much about this at all. And the reason this all matters is that at the end of this year, we've got the UN Climate Conference, which was supposed to have happened last year. It's happening in Glasgow. And this is the conference where countries around the world are supposed to come together and say what their pledges are for cutting their carbon emissions under the Paris Agreement. If you look at the pledges they've made so far and you add them all up, it's not enough to get us to where we need to be under the Paris Agreement, which is to reduce emissions so that we keep warming below 2 degrees and ideally below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial averages. So this really is the year when companies and countries have to step up and say what they're going to do. And I think it's possible that that in retrospect, 2021 could come to be seen as the sort of turning point for dealing with climate change. It may be that we don't deal with climate change and we just end up with a terrible mess. But in the scenario where we do deal with climate change, this seems very likely to be the pivotal year where the world actually, started to take meaningful action. And it will be the pandemic that may be seen as the sort of trigger for that, because it's a global problem, the pandemic, just like climate change. And it's an example of how when countries around the world work together and use science and cooperate, you really can achieve an enormous amount in a short space of time. We've seen that with the vaccines, and with any luck, we will see something similar with a green transformation. Now, that climate conference is one of many things that have been held over from last year. And obviously the Olympics is another one. We don't know whether they're going to go ahead. Probably not, but the Japanese are really, they really are doing everything they can to try and ensure that it goes ahead. Similarly, we've got the Dubai Expo, we've got the Euros. These are all going to go ahead, if they do go ahead, under the name of the 2020 version of themselves. So it's going to be Olympics 2020, not 2021, if it does go ahead. All those t-shirts and mugs have already been printed, and they don't want to change them now. But this means we're going to have very much a feeling of deja vu, of 2020 part 2 or 2020 take 2. I have to say, it feels like that already. Here we are, it's February again, almost March, and we're talking about what's the lockdown going to be like, what are the rules, when is it going to be lifted. We're all arguing or debating about whether we'll be able to go on summer holidays or not. This is exactly what was happening last year. So it does really feel like deja vu. And I think this phenomenon of losing track of what day it is, or even what time of year it is, or even what year it is going to continue for some time during this year. And finally, and again, this is slightly more optimistic, I suppose. This is potentially a wake-up call for other foreseeable threats. So policymakers around the world have got their hands full dealing with the pandemic, but this is something that very few people really had prepared for adequately. There were lots of drills done. Many Asian countries had the SARS pandemic a few years ago, and so they were better prepared than other countries. But essentially, we've seen just how wide the variation is in countries' preparedness for an event of this scale. And if you go back and look, there were people saying a pandemic is inevitable. It's a matter of when, not if. There were various scenarios that and war games that different countries went through to see how well prepared they'd be. And then in some cases they then ignored those plans altogether, and in other cases they listened to them. So policymakers will be asking themselves, well, what else is there that we could be blindsided by? What are we to be looking out for? What are those other threats? So if you're someone who's worried about those other threats, and in the same way that the people worried about pandemics have been beating their drums in recent years, then you'll be beating your drum this year and say, this is something else you should pay more attention to. So there are several things in this category. I wouldn't say climate change is, because climate change is something that is on the political agenda, and increasingly so, and that's a good thing. But what about things like antibiotic resistance, or bioterrorism, or nuclear proliferation, or even the concerns that some people have that artificial intelligence could go rogue and the robots could try and take over? I'm not so worried about that one, I have to say. The one that bothers me is actually antibiotic resistance, because if antibiotics stop working, then even routine surgery becomes potentially life-threatening, like it was in the pre-antibiotic era. And we don't have enough antibiotics in reserve, because when new ones are developed, we have to keep them in reserve and not use them. That means that there's no incentive to develop new ones, and so we haven't got a pipeline of new antibiotics in the way that we need. So that's the sort of thing that I would be worrying about. And if I'm a policymaker, I would be paying a little bit more attention to those sorts of things. Another one is, what about if an asteroid is discovered that's on a collision course with the Earth? One of the things that's happening this year is the launch of a space probe that's going to go and crash into an asteroid. Actually, not going to crash into it until next year, but it's going to crash into the moon of an asteroid. The asteroid is called Didymos, and its moon is inevitably called Didymoon. But it's very small. That means if you crash a space probe into it, you can see how that affects its orbit. And that would allow us to then model how we might try to deflect asteroids in the future if we discover one on a collision course with Earth. So I think the people who worry about these sorts of things will be getting a little more time in the limelight. Meanwhile, perhaps the future gazers who like to speculate on what's going to happen in the months and years to come might get a little less time in the limelight, since we all failed to see that the pandemic was coming. And perhaps we might even see a little more humility from future gazers. But do I want to commit myself to that prediction? No, I don't think I do. I think that would be a prediction too far. Okay, those are my top 10 things to watch out for that I think will be shaping the coming months. And now we can go over to Q&A. Thank you very much for listening.
Great, Tom. We really, really appreciate your presentation, as always, from The Economist. While we're waiting for questions from the Q&A section, I do have a couple of ones to start it off. And so the first one is, do you believe and it's sort of a three-parter, but just, do you believe that the central banks globally have provided too much liquidity? I've seen reports that in publicly listed companies in the US, 19% of them can't even pay their interest on their debt, and this is at a low interest level. And then the second part of that is sometimes this liquidity and very rich valuations means that large companies with overvalued currencies can buy the small companies, which have generally been innovative and provide most of the employment growth. And then the third part of it is just asset price inflation is really not on the Fed's agenda. So they're all sort of interrelated. So any comments you could make on that would be
absolutely. Well, again, the answer is there isn't a single answer. So I actually asked Carmen Reinhardt this, and she wrote for The World in 2021. But I spoke to her recently, and I said, "Are you more worried about inflation or deflation?" Because obviously that's a big debate going on at the moment. And she said both, because it depends where you are. So we're more worried about deflate, well, not so much about stagnation certainly in Europe and Japan, and we're probably a bit more worried about inflation in the US, as I said, because we think, if the stimulus, I mean, actually you should err on the side of a bigger stimulus, but yeah, we are a bit concerned that could lead to inflationary pressures. You're absolutely right that yes, you have this extraordinary situation where basically with share prices, good news is good news and bad news is good news. Because if there's bad news, it means rates will stay lower for longer, so share prices go up. And if there's good news, then everyone goes, hooray, and then share prices go up. And this is not sustainable. And so at some point, something has to give. But in the meantime, yes, it does mean that the big get bigger. And it does mean that they can use their shares as currency to acquire. We've got this M&A mania going on at the moment. And that could, in the long run, lead to less competition. So that is a concerning outcome, definitely.
Okay, so you're not particularly concerned about the liquidity that the central banks have provided as an overall. You're making comments on what the impact is, but you don't have a view specifically that it's too much or too little.
Well, I think it varies. So I don't know. I'm not a specialist on that. On central bank policy. I have colleagues who think about these things much more deeply. But my understanding of their position is that we're worried. Basically, our opinion varies depending on the country. There isn't a kind of overall picture on this.
Got it. Definitely, we'd love to hear from you on the surge of Bitcoin and any other digital currencies and how that's going to impact 2021 and beyond. We've seen the surges and the volatility. Yeah. Is it a good thing, bad thing, or what do you think?
I mean, caveat emptor, we're quite skeptical about Bitcoin because we don't think it works as any of the traditional functions of money. So what store of value, means of account, and what's the other one? Means of exchange. I mean, it's too volatile really as a store of value. You can't really buy things with it because the transaction cost is too high and it's too slow. So we are, I don't know, we just think it's a casino. Now, what I think is interesting is that clearly, if Bitcoin starts to become more important, which it does look like it is, then central banks are going to say, well, hang on a minute, we can't have this. We're going to have our own Bitcoin or we're going to have our own cryptocurrencies. And obviously China is leading the way there. They are experimenting with the digital yuan. It's not a cryptocurrency in the way that the Bitcoin is. It's because it's a central bank digital currency. South Korea is going to be experimenting with one this year as well. But I think all eyes are on China on this one because if anyone has an incentive to try doing this, it's China, because it would give the government, the central bank, a lot more control over the economy. You can pump money into it directly. You can monitor what's going on. And China also has this interesting situation where the digital payments infrastructure is very advanced, but it's in the hands of two companies, and one of them in particular, Ant Financial, clearly the government thinks is getting too big for its boots. And one way you could take it down a peg or two is to move everybody to a digital currency that the government controls directly. So I think the legacy of Bitcoin, I mean, I like to say that, but this maybe shows my age. I like to compare it with the with what happened in digital music. So Bitcoin is rather like Napster, which was sort of a fun experiment, and but it didn't end up being the winner in the long run. The winner in the long run was a sort of tamed, domesticated, and legal version, which was Spotify. And what Napster did was it showed that there was demand for a jukebox in the sky that let you call up any song, but Napster did it in a way that was unsustainable and illegal. And Spotify said, well, if that's what people want, we should give it to them in a legal way. So I think Bitcoin reveals that, you know, there is a demand for certain things, and I suspect what will end up happening is that it won't be Bitcoin itself that prevails as a global digital currency, but there will be these central bank digital currencies that end up, you know, having some of the advantages for both consumers and issuers, but not all of them.
Sure. Thank you for that. Angela Merkel's been around a long time, and so what's the future of Europe look like when she leaves? And then what do you think it's going to mean for Germany's relationship with the United States?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, Germany is. So I suppose the starting point for this is I can't remember which American president it was, but it was an American president who said, you know, when I want to call Europe, who do I call? And, you know, do you call the head of the European Commission? I don't think you do. Do you call the Chancellor of Germany? That's a bit more plausible. Do you call the Prime Minister of Great Britain? Not anymore. So obviously Brexit means that the idea that Britain can be a bridge between Europe and America is really off the table. And also Joe Biden is instinctively more friendly towards the EU, and Ireland, which is the big loser from Brexit. I mean, you know, it really is. It does so much of its trade with Britain, and now basically Britain is cutting itself off from the EU. And Joe Biden is instinctively, you know, sympathetic towards Ireland, and will take the EU's side in any conflicts between the EU and Britain, I suspect. So in that sense, there is a sort of potentially closer relationship between Europe and America than there has been before, because you don't have the sort of ambassadorial bridging role of Britain getting in the way, and I think you'll have a sort of separate relationship with Britain. We like to kid ourselves in Britain that, you know, we still have an important special relationship, but I don't know if people in America even talk about the idea of a special relationship. I think we're just deluding ourselves and sort of consigning ourselves to ever increasing irrelevancy by pulling out of the world's biggest trade bloc. So I think that does mean you know, the potential for a reset with and closer EU-US relations. They also have common interests in taking on China and pushing China on human rights, on intellectual property theft, on opening up its markets. And what something that we floated is that one of the big areas where the US and the EU disagree on is regulation of tech companies, and also on digital privacy. And so the Privacy Shield, which broke down last year, means that, you know, in some cases American companies can't process information. So European countries can't, information about European consumers can't be processed on American soil by American companies, and this is a big headache. So we have floated the idea of a sort of digital free trade zone, essentially a compromise between the US and the EU, where the EU would agree not to bash America's tech giants quite so much. The US would introduce some privacy rules, which would actually do quite a lot to rein in America's tech giants. One of the reasons they have so much power is that there's basically, you know, meaningless privacy regulation, and you know, in the long run, the way you rein in these companies is not by using lawsuits to go and bash the companies that are big now, but by using legal remedies to stop the companies that are going to grow big in the future from being too powerful. So we think that sort of gradual legislation to rein in the excesses of the tech giants, starting with privacy legislation, might be quite a good way to go. And that would then form the basis of a sort of digital free trade area and a closer alliance between the EU and the US to take on China, and decide which technologies will or will not be shared with China. So, you know, do we agree collectively whether to use Huawei gear in our 5G networks? Do we agree collectively which industrial machinery from Germany we're reluctant to export? What about chip making gear? What about other technologies, and so on? Obviously, the other thing to watch here is France, because Emmanuel Macron will be trying to pick up the torch of European leadership. He's got his eye on the election next year as well. So as Angela Merkel heads towards the door, expect the hyperactive Mr. Macron to be trying to assert himself as well. So I think that could all go a lot of ways, but it's an interesting time of change, and there are some potentially very beneficial outcomes for both sides of the Atlantic.
I have to ask you the follow-up question, which is there a chance that Britain will see the light and come back into the EU at some point down the road? Or
I hope so. Frankly, I hope so. I mean, I think it was the Prime Minister of Luxembourg who said a couple of years ago, he said it will take Britain 10 years to leave the EU, 10 years to realise it was a mistake, and 10 years to join again. And I think that's probably right. It may even be quicker than that. I mean, polls have shown consistently for the past couple of years that most people in Britain think that Brexit was a mistake, and the evidence that it is a mistake mounts constantly. I mean, we've got problems at our ports. We've essentially introduced a border inside our own country between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and it's a mess. However, another scenario is that Scotland breaks off. Northern Ireland reunites with Ireland, and you get Irish unification. Both of those things are entirely possible in the next 10 years, and then you just get England and Wales left over, and maybe Wales runs for it as well. I don't know. You have to change the flag. You have to do all sorts of things. So yes. And the other thing is, if we tried to rejoin the EU, I think EU rules would require us to join the euro. I think new entrants have to adopt the euro as well, and that would not be something Britain would do. So you can see the logic of rejoining, but you can also see very practical reasons why not. So I think it's more likely that we get a kind of multi-speed, multi-tier Europe, and that Britain rejoins on some tiers. If you look at what happened with Switzerland, which is a member of some higher tiers than we are, and the same with Norway as well. I mean, Norway is a member of the European Economic Area, isn't it? Which Switzerland isn't. And Switzerland is basically in a world of constant negotiation with the EU, constant referendums, and it's non-stop. And we are going to be in the same place. Our financial services companies don't know where they stand. They really want certainty, and they're not getting it. And it's just they're in a world of constant negotiation, and you just can't make decisions like that. So it really is a mess, and we've done a brilliant job of shooting ourselves in the foot.
Back to the technology issue, which is, there's giants sitting in the US and also in China, not much in Europe or even in India. Do you see a situation in which Europe and India, for example, sort of helps through government policy and so on to really help develop the tech sector there, just given its increasing importance? Or how do you see tech trends in the non-traditional tech world, at least by a FANG definition anyway?
Well, I think governments would love it if they could wave a magic wand and sort of magic a tech giant out of the air. But directing huge amounts of money to the tech sector, hasn't worked. When Europe has tried it, Europe was going to have its own European search engine and so on and so on. Now, it has to be said that the American tech industry has benefited from an enormous amount of government largesse on R&D, on funding of government contracts and so on. But it wasn't the US government that said let's fund the search engine or let's fund the social network. So I think it is it's just the entrepreneurial setup in the US just tends to give rise to these big companies more effectively. And the same is true in China. Now, one of the things that helps is you've got a big internal market in both of those places, which you don't have in Europe. The joke in Britain is that the British entrepreneur dreams of conquering the British market. And that's as far as the dream goes. Whereas if you look at other countries, I mean, Israel is a classic example. Israel, you have a small domestic market. So Israeli entrepreneurs typically start international on day one, Tel Aviv and Palo Alto. And even if they are, headquartered in Israel, they will assume that they need to expand into foreign markets from day one. But Britain is a sort of medium-sized market where entrepreneurs may just sort of start local and then not think any bigger. And then of course you've got the language barriers, and now you've got the trade barriers between Britain and Europe. But even when we were part of the EU, Spotify was really the example that everyone would point to of how you could grow a tech giant in Europe, and frankly, that was it. So yeah, I can't see. I don't think the answer is government. I'm afraid, unless it's government getting out of the way. It's sort of open markets for services, deregulation, that sort of thing. But I don't think throwing money at the tech sector magically creates some unicorns.
Fair enough. By the way, one of our attendees, Stephen Shore, said it was Kissinger who asked, "Whom do I call?" So,
there you are. Thank you. A famous Economist reader, of course.
Yes, that's right. I'm going to read this question from Paula Margolis, and it is, diplomats are very happy about the new agreement among the Caspian littoral countries for developing oil and natural gas. And I've heard them say that this will bring peace among these countries and finally end conflicts. How does the world address the issue of conflict resolution in less developed and warring countries without increasing the use of carbon?
Yeah, that is a special case, isn't it? Because if you can get them to agree not to kill each other so they can all exploit the oil,
Yes.
you get the benefit of peace, but you get the drawback of the oil extraction. Yeah, no. I mean, the bigger question is, as the oil price, as the use of oil goes down, what does that mean for political stability in the Middle East? I think that's in the back of our minds. That's what we're worried about. And are they trying to transition to a post-oil economy? No, they can't balance their budgets now. And so that's the real question. It's a global stability question as we move away from oil. And I don't think there's a simple answer to it. So yes, that in microcosm, that Caspian situation is that's a very, very sharpened version of that problem. But I think the Middle East states have the Gulf states have a real challenge about how if you've been buying off your population with oil money for a very long time and that goes away, what do you do? It seems inevitable that some sort of political liberalization is necessary, and that's very hard to imagine.
Fair enough. This is kind of one on all of our minds, which is, how do you see the continuing influence of social media on politics in the U.S. and the UK and around the world? And you've seen what's happened here in the U.S. and even in the last few months, but just any thoughts on that?
Yes, it's a wicked problem how you regulate this. So one of my books is actually on social media and how social media goes back to about the Roman period. And so media has been social for most of history, and it was only the kind of last 150 years between about 1850 and 2000 that media platforms became very, very concentrated, things like newspapers and radio, because they you needed big expensive machines to reach large audiences. You no longer do. You can use the internet again, and so that's taken us back to a much more fragmented media landscape. Yes, I mean, clearly there's going to be attempts to regulate here. I don't think getting rid of Section 230 is a very good idea. The fact that both Democrats and Republicans want to get rid of it for different reasons tells you that someone is going to be wrong and someone's not going to like what happens. I think it's actually a pretty good compromise. We had a pretty similar thing, funnily enough, in Britain with attitudes to the EU. So the left-wing Labour Party said that the EU was a neoliberal conspiracy to force neoliberal economic policy on everybody, whereas the right-wing Conservative Party said the EU was a sort of socialist conspiracy by the back door to force socialist social policy on everyone. And of course, they couldn't both be right, but they both managed to believe these different things about the EU that were entirely in opposition to each other at the same time. And that we have a similar situation with attitudes towards Section 230, where basically you believe the bits of it that you want to believe and you ignore the bits of it that you don't like. Anyway, so I think there'll be regulation on that front, and I don't know how effective that will be. And I think there will be these various antitrust things, but they take years and years and years. And history tells us that the tech companies can move more quickly than the regulators and the lawsuits do. So yes, I place my trust in the setting of longer term, basically legislation for future handling of privacy and that sort of thing, handling of personal data. I think that's a better way. If you look at how most regulated industries have evolved, whether it's banking or food or telecoms, essentially the way you control those industries is through these very, very tiny incremental legislative shifts. And I think that's where the tech industry is heading, that there will be, there'll be dedicated regulators for it that constantly fiddle with the rules to try and, generally steer them in the right direction. But the big kind of dramatic antitrust case breakup stuff is usually too little too late.
Fair enough. Thanks very much for that, Tom. Tom, I think we have time for one or two more questions. One is a pretty big one, so I'll let you decide how detailed you want to answer it, which is, question came in on, how do you see the trends in China? What are the big things that we need to be concerned about economically, politically, and militarily, and also the Silk Road, say for the next year and a half, 2 years? What should we be watching out for?
The Silk Road seems to be sort of declining in significance. So, people are saying the Belt and Road Initiative is dead, or it's failed to deliver, and so we may see the government sort of declare victory and then kind of go quiet about it. I don't know. So I wouldn't place too much emphasis on that. For me, the big question is Taiwan, actually. I mean, it's and in particular chips, because the position, the Trump administration was essentially tightening the screws. When they pulled the plug on ZTE by banning it from using American technology, a light bulb went on, and American politicians realized that if they wanted to, they could cripple any Chinese technology company by just banning American companies from doing business with them. And so that that's a very powerful tool, and you can Huawei seems to be in the process of spinning off its smartphone division, because it's not going to be able to make smartphones if it hasn't got Android and it hasn't got the chips that it needs, and so on and so on. So that's potentially very dangerous, because if you go too far down that road of just saying, right, China, we're going to just cut you off at the knees, that's a very dangerous thing to do, because that could antagonize China. That if you want to push them towards attacking Taiwan, there isn't a better way of doing it. So what we've suggested, and there's a piece about this in The World in 2021, in fact, is that if you have a more nuanced tech policy, particularly where the US and its allies work together, and those allies are democracies, including Taiwan, but if you take a more nuanced position, rather than forcing China either into military action or into a sort of crash program to develop its own semiconductor industry, which would, its semiconductor industry is 8 to 10 years behind the rest of the world, but clearly they do want to catch up, and it's not in America's interest that they do. So surely managing the relationship and managing the technologies that you do allow China to have, and that you do allow yourself and your allies to use from China, is a way of de-escalating things. So I would, that's really for me, that's the debate. And Taiwan really is at the center of this now. If you look at all of the big, back to the tech giants, they've all gone into making their own chips, because to run big data centers and AI, even to run self-driving cars like Tesla does, you need to have your own chips. Or Apple's, the reason the iPhone is so great is that Apple designs its own chips. All of these chips are made in Taiwan, which has the best chip making factories. The processing chips, the most advanced chips. Intel has completely fumbled here. The best case scenario is it catches up in a couple of years, but I think that's pretty unlikely. You can do things like encourage the creation of new fabs. So TSMC is being encouraged to build a new fab in America, but this all takes years. So I think the risk is of escalation if this is badly handled, and I'm more optimistic that the Biden administration might take a more careful and nuanced approach to this, because otherwise bad things could happen in the South China Sea.
Fair enough. Tom, we really, really, really appreciate this very erudite presentation. You gave us a lot of things to think about. And so I'd like to just turn it over to Wayne Cooper to sort of close this session out. But again, on behalf of the World Affairs Council of SHAR, we really enjoyed your presentation. I'll turn it over to Wayne. Thank you.
I hope I'm on now. Thank you so much, Ryan. And boy, what a very timely program. Great presentation. And thank you very, very much, Tom, for that. We also want to thank all of y'all for joining us today. And really a special thanks to LJ and the fantastic staff for putting together this very good, distinguished speaker series. This is just one of many, many great speakers that we have had and are going to have. We got some great speakers coming up. Remember, If you're not a member, please become one. And if you are a member, please think about increasing your membership and upgrading your membership. Next Tuesday, I think I'll let LJ tell you about the former bureau chief of the New York Times. And I've seen some correspondence going back and forth between she and the staff. And I think we're in for a real treat. We'll look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. LJ?
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, Tom. This was an amazing opportunity for us to learn what you think, what the Economist of London thinks. We are inviting you, as we discussed before the session, to come and join us in Charlotte when the time and situation allows. Thank you again for being here with us today, finding time in your busy schedule from London. London under snow cover, it's something to behold. If no one has seen that before, please go Google it. I understand this is the largest snowfall in many years, even decades. Thank you again. We look forward to seeing you and talking to you in the future. And as you know, you can get a subscription to The Economist through the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. They're our partners, and we appreciate all that they do very much. Next week, we have two programs. One is a travel program in Paris and Sienne, and just a wonderful, all of us want to be in London and Paris at this point of time, anywhere, but locked at home. So if you're interested in the significance of the River Seine for Paris and history, we have a wonderful program with the former correspondent of New York Times in Paris. And on Thursday, Infosys, a leading major Indian company that has a large presence here in Charlotte. We are speaking to their co-president of the company. It's on Thursday. Please join us. And for you who want to continue this interesting conversation, we still have questions that we can answer. Please join us for the VIP reception that will start in a minute. The World Affairs Council staff, the great staff that we have, the great team that we have, will connect you. You're all invited. Thank you, Tom. All the very best. Say hi to London for us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.